Believe me, expression is insanity. It arises out of our insanity. It also has to do with turning pages, with hunting from one page to the other, with flight, with complicity in an absurd solidified effusion, with a vile overflow of verse, with ensuring life in a single sentence, and in turn with the sentences seeking insurance in life. Reading is a vice which can replace all other vices, or temporarily take their place in more intensely helping people live. It is a debauchery, a consuming addiction. No, I don't take any drugs. I take books. Welcome to another episode of the Books of Some Substance podcast. This is David.
This is Nathan, and today we're talking about Ingeborg Bachmann's 1971 novel, Malina. So this novel follows an unknown woman in Vienna in her relationship with a man, Ivan, who lives just a few doors down, and her roommate, Malina. And this book was the first part of an unfinished trilogy that she intended to write called Ways of Dying, or Todesarten.
You got to give it a little German flair.
That's really hard to do an accent on demand.
Yes it is. Todesarten.
Todesarten.
That sounded Swedish.
Yeah, or
Danish.
I don't know.
Sure. Yeah, that's all right.
An effort.
Yeah.
I'm really excited to be talking about this book because I'm ready to stop thinking about it, because I've been thinking a lot about it, because it is such a strange book, and Ingeborg Bachmann herself is such an interesting character, and it's the only novel that she completed. She was primarily a poet, and apparently very famous in the German-speaking world, and also something of a philosopher. So I think in this one book there's a lot going on, and I'm like, how are we going to get into this? What are we going to talk about? Because I kind of feel like I'm not quite smart enough to hold all of it.
When I read this book, this was a while ago, so we're recording this kind of late. The last time I read it was when we were originally going to record this, which was before I had a kid. So it's been like a month of me not sleeping or reading very much. So prior to that, though, I did read this book twice because I found it so bizarre and engrossing, and yet very difficult to talk about, because it seems to be about a few different things: patriarchal control, one's ability to express themselves in language, dealing with trauma and how narrative, the stories we tell ourselves, affect the trauma of our past, all sorts of things. I mean, it's a wild book in that, like in the passage that I read, the syntax is all kind of over the place. It doesn't really form to one particular style. I mean, there's some fantasy writing in here. There's telephone conversations. There's musical interludes.
And the style just kind of shifts too, because the first time I was very confused. Let's just talk about those telephone conversations for a second, which I liked. I liked the way she wrote this, because it just like interrupts. It's very choppy. It's not labeled who's speaking. But I realized, I paid close attention to this a second time through. At some times, it's just the part of the dialogue from her. I presume from her or from him. It's just half of the dialogue. And I kind of imagine it like in a movie, right? It's like sometimes the camera, you're just overhearing a conversation from one side. But then at other times, it jumps back and forth.
Yes, and it's
And
presented
you're
in
at
the
least
same
hearing
way,
it.
like the same.
Presented in exactly the same way. And I also really liked, they're all fragments. They never actually say anything.
No. Do you have an example?
Just for reference,
Yeah.
let me just see if I can find an example. Here's a random one. What did I think? Very interesting. Oh, right. So, and you. Nothing much. It was interesting. You be sure and go to bed early. You're the one who's yawning. You should go to sleep. I'm not going to. I don't know yet. No, but tomorrow I have to. Do you really have to tomorrow?
Well, aren't you defensive? Why are you so defensive? You have to attack. Come on, attack me. Show me your hands. No, not the inside. I don't read hands. You can see it on the skin of your hands. In women, I can see it right away. Is that one? It feels like one half of the conversation. So yeah, there's no period at the end of like the line. There's just like a line break, almost like a
They
poem.
all kind of just like trail off.
They're very bizarre.
And then, like you said, there's the fantasy interstitials, which apparently, this was translated by
Philip
Bohm, and he did the original translation of this into English.
Okay.
And then he retranslated it and updated it. And I was reading, I think it's in the introduction, he mentions that he got some feedback, I guess, from native German speakers. And one of the things that he learned was that the interstitials, at least one section is in the German, is pulled directly from an old English story.
Oh, interesting.
But it's so it's translated in German, but it's a direct pull. Just exactly, it's she didn't rewrite it or summarize it. It's the direct pull from the German. So he went back and took the original English, and that's that section. I think it's the part about the willows when she's lost our princess of the Danube.
She no longer saw any way out of this singular world of willows, winds, and waters. The willows whispered more and more. They hissed, they laughed, they screamed shrilly and sighed and moaned. She buried her head in her arms. She could move neither forward nor backward. She could merely choose between the water and the overpowering willows. So, like, even this fantasy character is trapped in a kind of stasis, I guess, which is how the main character feels.
Do you remember where what is even this fantasy story in the middle of this narrative?
Like, why it exists? Because I think Ivan
here?
gets upset that she's telling another sad story, and he's like, why don't you just write something with a happy ending? You never write anything with happy endings. Everything's so miserable. And so she starts to like rewrite this fantasy. Yeah. Okay.
I think you're right. So she starts like this sort of like pre-civilization princess traveling along the Danube, and it's kind of this semi-fantasy story. But like you said, it doesn't really end up very happy either. I think she gets kidnapped and then tries to get home and then gets lost in the willows. It's kind of a summary of the book, actually.
Yeah, it feels like it mirrors the main character's experience in this narrative that's presented. Although the ending is different, obviously. And also the italics that she uses in that carry over into other parts in the book, which is, well, it's just the fact that I noticed that the italics represent the fantasy world. It's the only time they're used. It's when she's writing about something fantastical or she's rewriting that fairy tale. But occasionally she'll interject these italics about just random things where you don't know if it's part of the fairy tale world or if it's just her sort of imagining some sort of future or just fantasizing. And there's a section of a small paragraph on page 97 in italics. A day will come when people will have black golden eyes. They will see beauty. They will be freed from dirt and from every burden. They will rise into the sky. They will dive into the waters. They will forget their calluses and hardships. A day will come when they will be free. All people will be free, even from the freedom they had presumed. There shall be a greater freedom beyond measure, a freedom to last a whole life long. And it's just in the middle of these sections where she's, I think it's near her being interviewed I'm not entirely sure where. But I just thought it was funny that she put this idea of personal and, I guess, the idea of people being free. She put it in italics as a sort of fantasy, knowing that we are not, or we cannot be. Because she certainly doesn't feel that way, the protagonist. She feels burdened to these men, to Ivan, to Malina, to her father.
There's where she starts to give operatic directions in the dialogue at the end.
Fortissimo, dolente.
I didn't even know what to make of that at first. I was like, why is there Italian all of a sudden? But then I thought, this is kind of an interesting way to read dialogue, because it's like one of them was like a long trombone. It's like, okay, I can kind of see how that relates to that piece of dialogue. And there's actually musical notation in here too.
There is.
I did not try to play that out.
No.
And there's just the way that she handles dialogue, which like is like a play, or much of it is just me, it's text. Malina, is that all that's keeping you awake? Kill him. Me, sotto voce. Yes, that's all. Malina, and what are you going to do? Me, forte, fortissimo. Nothing. Stylistically, well, and then there's just the three phases or the sections of the book.
Yes.
Which I think we need to spend some time talking about.
Okay, why don't we move through them quickly, or at least.
Well, real quickly, let me just make this point, and then we can move into it, because I think it applies to the sections of the book too. The style is not consistent. Like, she kind of introduces a stylistic trope and then doesn't follow through with it, or it changes.
What do you mean?
Or introduces a stylistic trope later on. Well, like the opera, for instance, that only occurs in the last dialogue.
Yeah.
Which is primarily the last section of the book is primarily a dialogue between her and Malina.
Yeah.
It's not like, I see, it's like she's developed this trope and then runs the narrative through this trope. It's kind of like these tropes come and go as they're useful, and I think that lends a sort of manic quality and another manic quality to the book.
Yes, which almost every aspect of the book feels very manic and panic-inducing.
And yet somehow there seems to be some kind of logic that holds it together.
Okay.
Because it's easy to read a book like this, or it's easy to assume that reading a book like this would just feel disjointed. And for all its disjointedness, it doesn't feel disjointed to me. It does seem like it's revolving around some idea, but that idea is hard to contain.
Okay. So I think because you said there's different styles, but there's a lot of repetition as well in terms of sentence fragmentation, narrative focus, narrative voice. All those sort of feel very similar in each section. Some things are emphasized or not. The phone conversations all appear in the same way. But yeah, in terms of it there being some sort of idea that ties everything together, I don't know if there's a singular idea necessarily. I think there's a few, maybe. Or at least, do you mean each section feels tied around an idea? Because I think that is certainly more true. Like the first section, Happy with Ivan, which feels very ironic for a title, is her really seems to be investigating obsession and how it shapes a person. Because everything in that section is showing her devotion to this man that seems to care about her almost not at all.
Or she doesn't present whatever that aspect is of the relationship that seems to be so appealing.
Yes. So she describes
only the obsessive side of it.
She describes how appealing it is, but we never see any quality in him that seems worthy of such insane devotion. And there's parts of it that are like sad and funny. So I'm looking at page 58, and this is early on, and she's talking about her obsession with him. She says, "I inhabit this animated world of a half-wild woman, freed for the first time from the judgments and prejudices of my environment, no longer prepared to pronounce any sentence on the world, ready only for an immediate answer, for lamentation and pity, joy and happiness, hunger and thirst, because for too long I have been alive without really living. My imagination, richer than any Yahe fantasy, is finally brought into motion by Ivan. Inside me he has set off something immense, which is now radiating from me. Without interruption, I emit rays to the world which needs them. I beam out from this one point, which is not only the center of my life, but of my will to live well, to be useful once again. For I would like Ivan to need me like I need him, and for the rest of our lives. Sometimes he too needs me, because he rings the doorbell. I open the door. He's holding a newspaper. He looks around and says, 'I have to go right away. Do you need your car tonight?' Ivan has left with my car keys, and even this short appearance of his shakes reality once again. Each of his sentences affects me, and the oceans of the earth and the constellations." Just, I don't know why that passage really makes me laugh, because the build-up is so intense, right? She talks about this immense feeling, this urge to live, and he knocks on the door and goes, "Hey, I need to borrow your car." Yeah, it's really hard to see anything in Ivan other than a guy he's got kids, he's divorced, he seems quite busy in his life. He doesn't seem like a great dude. He doesn't seem like a terrible person necessarily, but certainly not a
But
great
here's
guy.
what Ivan has. Has. Ivan has a reason to live.
Okay.
And he calls her out on this. He's like, your problem is you have no reason to live. And I think that she attaches herself to Ivan. It may be partly because he doesn't have time, because he's got things he has to do, significantly driven by his two children, I think, and his mysterious job, I guess. But he has responsibilities that drive his actions. She doesn't. She's free of those.
And he judges her for this, and this makes her what? So you're saying like this spurs her to become obsessed with him?
No, I think I at some point, I don't think that conversation really goes anywhere. I don't really remember where it is. He makes that comment. It's kind of just like, it just kind of like hangs out there, I think. He makes that comment that she needs to find a reason to live. But you said he doesn't have anything. He doesn't have any qualities that are attractive at all. But what he has is this reason to live. And so it's like he has a direction. He's always going in a direction. And the reality that she inhabits is there is no direction. There is no momentum. So here's this momentum who happens to live 3 doors down. And she gets kind of like pulled into that current. And, you can almost say it's, gravitational. And I think it's, this conversation is going to be really hard to, good luck editing this one, David.
I don't know. So what is this?
Can I throw an idea out there?
Hit me.
That what we're reading is less about a particular man, a particular woman, and we're reading about, let's say, energetic qualities.
Okay.
And so we have 3 primary ones. And maybe we can talk about father and what does father represent. But we could say, I'm going to go in way over my depth. Like I said, I'm not intelligent enough to talk about this book, so correct me or judge me. You brought this up actually before. You've read Jung?
Yeah.
I think it's a really interesting idea and I don't know if this idea is in vogue anymore, but that there's a sort of feminine energy, there's a masculine energy, and that a woman has feminine and masculine energy, and a man has feminine and masculine energy, that we are a composite of the anima and animus energies, which have qualities that Jung described. And that our protagonist, our unknown female writer, represents that feminine energy. Ivan represents that masculine energy. They don't share a whole lot of the opposite energy. Malina is right there between. And in my reading of the book, what we're reading is this passage of this woman who has no way in the world. She can't navigate the world. She doesn't understand the world. She doesn't understand strategy. She doesn't understand deception. She's responding to everything emotionally. She becomes educated. So this woman's then attracted to Ivan, who is a man of the world. He understands how the world works. Through her delirium of father and dealing with her trauma, she's educated by Malina, who I think Malina is actually her. Malina is the dormant masculine energy in her.
The animus.
The animus in her.
It certainly feels
and
that way.
And by the end of it, that animus has completely obliterated the anima. Because so to me, it sounds like the statement that she's making is this pure feminine energy, the pure anima, that we don't live in a world for that, because we live in a world that's been constructed by animus. So the woman who, I feel like an idiot talking about this because I don't know what I'm talking about. So everybody, please forgive me.
Nathan is saying all women are over emotional. That's what he's saying.
That's what it sounds like I'm saying, doesn't it? But that we have these different ways of being, and that we all have that. But if we say that, okay, well, the feminine energy is that emotional energy, the world does not reward that. And I don't know that I fully agree with this anyway. But that, so for our character, for our protagonist who has all this, emotional energy and other things, her options are to align herself with Ivan, so then she can have balance, or destroy it. So she aligns it with something external, aligns it with an animus, an external animus, or change herself internally and align herself internally with animus. But that there's no place in the world that we inhabit for anima. I don't know if that made any sense to anybody.
I think it's a great reading of the book, actually. I think it's quite interesting because it certainly lines up with how it ends, with this murder, as she refers to it as.
Where she just vanishes into the wall.
Yeah, and then watches Malina have a conversation where he says...
With Ivan.
Yes, with Ivan.
Yeah, Ivan calls.
He's like, oh, yeah, I'm looking for blah, blah, blah. He's like, what? There's no woman here. There's never been anyone by that name here. Interesting. Okay. That's making me think about the book in a way that makes sense, at least from the recollection of my memory. Because, yeah, it does feel to me that Malina is this aspect of her that is rational and trying to...
And he's also, he's like coldly rational. Like he doesn't respond to things. And
yeah.
Ingeborg Bachmann, kind of was in her young adulthood, youth, was very aligned with like logical positivism. It's like it's got to be logical, it's got to be provable, it's got to be empirical. And the problem with logical positivism is it obliterates humanity.
Yeah.
It doesn't explain anything that actually means anything to a human being. And she was so dedicated to that. She tried to use that thinking to disprove Heidegger. That was her dissertation. And then she later turned away from that. She became critical of that philosophy.
Yeah. And I did read that she was into psychoanalysis as well. Yes, I can't remember where, but so that it makes sense that she would maybe have some of these concepts running through, at least in the background of this narrative creation. It makes sense.
And like your criticism of, when we read "This is the truest, a portrait in language of female consciousness, truer than anything."
Yeah, it feels like a
31. It's like, well, the woman in this book is kind of crazy.
Yeah, I mean, it feels like an exaggeration of a negative stereotype of female consciousness, which is calling this the truest depiction of that feels like an insult to me.
But when you think of it as
not a specific, like, not a person, but an idea.
Yeah, and then you look at that and you say, well, we can only imagine a world in which the idea represented by our unnamed narrator, we can only imagine a world in which that's nonsensical. Because we live in a world defined by the language of patriarchy. And so does a woman who presumably possesses some of these qualities and finds themselves having to make certain compromises. Either train yourself out of that, embrace logical positivism, eliminate everything that gives your life any intrinsic worth, something along those lines.
Okay.
Embrace some other figure who can do that work for you, because the universe that you could create with a different language, maybe it's the one of our princess of something. Yeah. I can't remember. I wrote it down. What was the princess of Kagran?
Sure.
That sort of that fairy tale world. Maybe that could exist with a new language. And I think it's really beautiful the way that she writes this story, because like with a good story, when you try to explain it, you ultimately can't capture entirely what she's saying or entirely what she's communicating.
Yeah. And is this because of the limitations of language? Certainly.
You could say that it's the inherent limitations of language, or I think possibly it's the inherited limitations of language.
Yeah. Page 77. That there's nothing new under the sun. No, I'd never say that. New things do exist. They do. You can bank on that. Herr Mühlbauer. It's just that seen from here, where nothing is happening anymore, and that's a good thing too, one must tolerate the past completely. It's not yours and not mine, but who's asking whether it is? You simply have to put up with these things. In their countries, other people don't have the time. They're busy, planning and dealing. Sitting in their countries, they're the ones who are behind the times because they lack a language. For always, in all ages, those without a language rule. I will tell you a terrible secret. Language is punishment. Language must encompass all things, and in it all things must again transpire according to guilt and the degree of guilt. Very interesting things happening there about dealing with the past and being restricted by the language because language must encompass all things. And all things must again transpire according to guilt and the degree of guilt. There is this sense of, there's this overwhelming sense of feeling guilty in this book as well. Guilty for not doing something for Ivan, guilty for, I mean, we can get into the father middle section. There's weird sense of guilt there with her family. Guilt over being herself, I suppose, and wrestling with Malina and his criticisms, or her internal criticisms, if Malina really is just this Tyler Durden-like figure. Language is punishment.
Let's bring up Wittgenstein.
Oh, yeah?
So after she kind of turned her back on logical positivism, either with help of Wittgenstein or maybe after that she found Wittgenstein. But Wittgenstein was a philosopher, also Austrian, as a matter of fact, who had beef with Bertrand Russell and the logical positivists as well. And he wrote a short book called the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, in which, using the language of logic, he tried to demonstrate that language cannot touch certain things. Language cannot touch certain aspects of reality. That language needs to confine itself to talking about what it can talk about. And famously, the most famous line in this book is the very last one, which is very poetic and evocative. What we cannot speak about, we must pass over in silence. And so Ingeborg Bachmann kind of takes this as a challenge to speak that unspeakable. Like, how can you, as a writer, you know, she's not writing philosophy anymore, how can you try to communicate this that language cannot communicate? And I think I think maybe that's why the strangeness in the book, why it makes these shifts, because it's like once you settle into, oh, this means this, that means that, you've lost it. You're lost already. And so let's change. Let's zag. And now you have to bring a new understanding again.
There's something in that, I think, even in like the small things. One of the stylistic things that we didn't talk about are the letters that she writes.
Yeah, the letters. Right? What?
So I think you can kind of see that this punishment of language, this wrestling with language in her revision of these letters that are seeming, just piled up on the floor and crumpled balls of paper. Letters to presidents, letters to, I can't remember who else, but
her psychiatrist, maybe her doctor.
Yeah. Yes. And you see her sort of trying to work things out and revising and rewriting and cutting out the sort of fat of the letter to try to get to the point, reducing it almost to the point, like if you were to read only the last letter, you would be confused. But having started where you did in the narrative, and you kind of read these versions getting smaller and smaller, you kind of go, okay, I can see what she's trying to do in terms of reduction to like the most base. It's almost like a logical format.
I did not pick up on that, actually.
There's moments where she's like rewriting, and she mentions that a lot of these letters never get sent.
I had the impression that she never sent any of them.
I mean, that's entirely
she
possible.
Buries them underneath her floor.
Yeah, because of the privacy of mail, which is one of the weirder parts of the book when she goes into that whole thing about
her crush on this postal worker who refused to deliver the mail.
Because she would like to keep and preserve the privacy of mail. I don't... very strange. Very strange.
Give me a moment. One of my lights went out.
I think I found... I don't know if this is what you were talking about when you were talking about Ivan telling her she has sort of nothing, no reason. It says, this is on page 209, Since I let my head droop, Ivan says, you just don't have anything that requires you to be there. He'll win his case, because who wants anything from me? Who needs me? But Malina should help me find a reason for my being here, since I don't have an old father to support in his old age. I don't have any children always needing something like Ivan's: warmth, winter coats, cough syrup, gym shoes. Nor does the law of conservation of energy apply to me. I am the first perfect example of waste, extravagant, ecstatic, and incapable of putting the world to any reasonable use, able to show up at the masked ball of society or stay away like someone who has been detained, or has forgotten to make a mask, or can no longer find his costume out of carelessness, and so one day will no longer be invited. When I stand in front of a familiar door in Vienna, perhaps because I am invited, it occurs to me at the last moment it might be the wrong door, or day, or hour, and I turn around and drive back to the Ungargas, too quickly, tired, too much in doubt. And then, the very next paragraph, Malina asks, have you never thought how much trouble other people have often gone to because of you? And it just kind of goes into their conversation, but Malina really does sort of pop up and interrogate her quite often, right?
Mm-hmm.
As a way to sort of challenge her thinking about who she is and what she is. And I want to get into two things. Malina, in a quote that you read a while back, talks about he's pushing her to kill him. Him maybe being her visions of her father in the second part of the book.
I think that's what he's referring to.
So why don't we go into that, because that second section, which is the shortest and certainly the most bizarre, violent, fever dreamish, where when I first read it, because it's interspersed with Malina having conversations with her about these nightmarish visions that she's having, it almost feels like he's got her on some sort of hallucinogenic drug, treating her like in a psych ward, just like pushing the boundaries of her psyche into exploring her past.
It's interesting that you say that, given the reference to Yahe.
Yeah. But it feels that way to me. And there's also a mention early in the book where she says she's already had her final phone call, so she's not allowed another phone call. And I was like, wait, what? Where? What? So there's a few places where I thought maybe she's in some sort of psychiatric facility.
Oh, interesting.
But, nothing concrete enough. But let me just ask you about that second section. What do you make of it? Especially in relation to this theory that you have of that society as it functioned then, maybe still today, cannot allow for this kind of waste of non-functioning, non-rationalistic energy in the world. Does that play into how you read the second part, or is it a separate thing?
I mean, I do think it's all part of the same thing, because the father is definitely, he is the very worst imaginable, the worst that you could possibly imagine when you think of patriarchy. When you think of masculinity.
Yeah.
When you think of human beings.
Just violent,
controlling, raping, incest, deceptive.
Yeah. And it's hard not to read her personal life into this section.
It really
her
is.
Her father was a Nazi and was, gladly participating, and I think was imprisoned as a prisoner of war for a spell at some point. And then when...
I don't recall.
My understanding is that he was, but then when he was returned after the war, she more or less refused to interact with him because of what he had done.
So there's her literal father, and then there's the fatherland. I mean, she was in Nazi Austria. Like she was in the Nazi machine, and in this fascistic society, where all sorts of things crimes were committed in her name, effectively. And so trying to excise that, like that's your legacy, that's your childhood, those are some of your early memories. So certainly it's one thing to grapple with a sense of not belonging in a patriarchy in a general sense, where Ivan has things to do and is too busy and beats you at chess. That's difficult enough. But within the greater context of coming out of Nazism, of having your own father being a card-carrying Nazi, and I don't know what else to make of it. I mean, it just hammers home the sort of trauma and violence, the mark that can leave on a person. And real quick callback, I just opened this page randomly and saw this in this section. My child doesn't have a name yet. I feel he is nameless like the unborn. I have to give him a name soon, and my name as well. I whisper a suggestion. Animus. So this is the child after her father rapes her. She becomes pregnant with Animus.
Yeah, it's really hard to make head or tails of what's really going on in that section, other than just wrestling with with the trauma of a horrible past.
This is what Malina says on 184 during one of their dialogues that intersperses this fever dream. Once one has survived something, then survival itself interferes with understanding. And you don't even know which lives came before and which is your life today. You even mix up your own lives.
Now that's some cold rationality right there. Just survival poisons understanding.
Yeah.
And talking about the past, just above on the same page, she tells Malina, it was completely different. Then I took a good look around and I noticed that everybody was biding their time, both in my vicinity and also far away. They don't do anything else, at least nothing in particular. They put sleeping pills in people's hands, or razor blades. They make sure you lose your head while you're walking along the edge of a cliff, that you're completely drunk when you open the door of a moving train, or simply let you come down with some disease. If they wait long enough, a breakdown is bound to occur. Your end will be long or short. Some people survive that, but only just barely, which is why he's talking about survival. And that seems to be her sort of describing another point just after the war, is like everyone prostituting themselves. I can't remember where that passage is, but it's somewhere around that. Yeah, early on in that section, she describes her father putting her into a gas chamber, even.
Yeah, I think that's maybe the first way that he kills her.
Yeah, and then she starts imagining her mother and a sister that she may or may not have. Yeah, it's an unreal thing. But there's one section where she talks about that takes refuge in books, and that her father brings these men in to start burning them or taking them away. And it's another reference to her sort of finding refuge in writing. The men leave the house. Each has been given a tip. They wave their large handkerchiefs and shout, "Heil Book!" They tell the neighbors and all the curious onlookers, our work is finished. Now Holzweig has fallen down, also Ecce Homo, and I squat amid the books, benumbed and bleeding. It had to come to this, for I caressed them every evening before going to sleep. And Malina had given me the most beautiful books. My father will never forgive that. And they've all become illegible. It had to come to this. There's no order anymore. And I'll never know where Kernberger was or Audio Hearn. I lie down among the books. I again caress them, one after the other. In the beginning there were only 3, then there were 15, then over 100. And I ran to my first bookcase in my pajamas. Good night, gentlemen. Good night, Mr. Voltaire. Good night, first. May you rest well, my unknown authors, sweet dreams, Mr. Pirandello, my respect, Mr. Proust. Cher, Thucydides. For the first time, the gentlemen are saying good night to me. I try to avoid touching them so as not to stain them with blood. Good night, says Joseph K. to me. Yeah, there's this sense that early on, even as a young person, this narrator found something in all of these books.
There's that's a really beautiful passage, and the allegiance of these writers. You know, there's also a lot of repetition of the number 3.
Is that right?
Yeah. You said the book started with 3. She has to fall down 3 times before she can rise. And the way that she ultimately defeats her father is with 3 hard, luminous stones. I like this passage. Okay. They are 3 hard, luminous stones, which have been thrown to me by the highest authority, where even my father has no influence. And I alone know what message each stone contains. Young lightning is constantly flashing inside the first reddish stone, which has fallen from heaven into my cell. It says, live in wonder. The second blue stone, flashing with all possible hues of blue, says, write in wonder. And I am already holding the third stone in my hand, white and radiant, whose fall can be stopped by no one, not even my father. But the cell grows so dark that the third stone's message cannot be read. The stone can no longer be seen. I shall discover this final message after I am freed. What she writes there, I mean, it's so, I think, reflective of her sort of philosophy, is that she's writing for a utopia that she can't conceive of. And it's, and how beautiful is that? It's like you have it in your hand, but you don't know what it means. And it's like all you can do is live in wonder, write in wonder. And that's what you could do in this cell of
existence.
Of existence. And that's how you can hold off the darkness. There's still so much I want to talk about.
At the end of that second section with her father is where we get a line that's reminiscent of a line that you see often repeated in reviews and writings about her, where she talks about how that fascism begins in people, in relationships to people. Do you know this? I don't have the quote handy, but it's quite a common one. Maybe you can look it up while I'm reading this. But at the end, in her conversation with Malina, she says, also, I wanted to tell him something I've now understood for a long time, namely that people don't die here. They are murdered. That's why I always understand how he could have entered my life. Somebody had to do it. He was the one. Malina says, so you'll never again say war and peace? Never again. It's always war. Here there is always violence. Here there is always struggle. It is the everlasting war. So she talks about it being a murder. And of course, the final line is, it was murder.
It was murder.
Did you find that one quote?
Yeah, so that quote is, fascism begins in relations between people. Fascism is the primary element in the relationship between a man and a woman.
I think I used that in my matrimony ceremony. Those were my words. Didn't go well.
Maybe we can shift gears a little bit, because something that I want to ask you about, especially since we just read, or right before this episode, we read Waiting for the Barbarians by J.M. Coetzee, which is very clearly has, some political intent.
Yeah.
Her perspective was that literature should engage with the world, should have purpose. It's not art for art's sake.
Interesting.
So
this is a rather oblique way of interacting with the world.
I know, I was going to say, so I kind of have to take her at her word and think that she had some sort of intent on this having some kind of, making some sort of impact. I mean, not in the world of literature, you know, in the world of art, but it having some sort of, let's say, a political impact. I mean, if this is the way she goes about doing it, I mean, it's pretty artful. Yeah. It's not exactly a piece of propaganda, in my opinion. But how do you take that?
What do I think about it in general, or specifically in relation to this book? Because,
well, both, I guess. Well, let me read you the quote real quick. And this was from a lecture that she gave in Frankfurt in 1959. If we quiescently allow the scornfulness of this art is art to serve as a substitute for the whole, and if writers patiently endure it and encourage it through flippancy and a deliberate disillusion of the act of communication with society, an act that is always imperiled and therefore always in need of renewal, and if society withdraws from literature whenever it is imbued with a serious and uncomfortable spirit desirous of transformation, this will be tantamount to a declaration of bankruptcy. Simply making it possible for people to appreciate a few difficult artistic forms, simply awakening an understanding of art, this prophylactic against art, which is intended to render it innocuous, this cannot be the writer's function. Under such shabby auspices, none of us would have anything to lose from one another. Neither art from human beings nor human beings from art. In such a case, there would also no longer be any need for any questions. I think what she's saying in this passage, and it's an interesting lecture. I don't know if you had a chance to read it, about what is literature. But she's saying to sort of retreat into art is art, like it doesn't need to have any communication with society. Well, that's a bankrupt idea and is benefiting nobody, but also for society to not engage with art because, or to engage with art that asks serious questions is also bankrupt. I think she's basically throwing down the gauntlet on both sides. She's saying that literature or art has to have some role to play in communicating with society, but you can't just communicate with familiar language. So you have to be pushing that forward because familiar language loses meaning as time wears on, basically. So, and then if your public is unwilling to engage with difficult concepts in art, then they're also not engaging with the reality that we find ourselves upon.
I see. Okay.
And I don't mean to misrepresent her views either, because I think she's very much not sort of a social realist propagandist in any sense. And I'm gonna read another quote from this that I like quite a lot, saying like, where does art live? Where's the place for art? Art has already been shifted from one site of residence to another an incredible number of times. From the house of God into the house of the ideals. From the house beautiful, which is like a home decor magazine, to the Bateau Ivre, and then into the gutters, and then again into the house of dreams, and into the temple with the hanging gardens, and then onwards into the pseudo-mystical suffocating atmosphere of blood and soil, and further still into the house of humanity and the house of politics. It has never enjoyed a moment's peace, as though no permanent dwelling has ever been allocated to it.
That's certainly more accurate in terms of art's place in society, or at least how it's perceived and held. That certainly seems to be true. There's a quote that I read somewhere recently. I just pulled it up again. Someone was making reference to it. It's by one of, I know we've read him for the podcast, and I'm a big fan of his writing, William Gass. And here he's talking about the contemporary American writer, which I think maybe this is more true of what he's saying, but certainly seems to be true from my perception of how people view certainly literature. He says, the contemporary American writer is in no way a part of the social and political scene. He is therefore not muzzled, for no one fears his bite, nor is he called upon to compose. Whatever work he does must proceed from a reckless inner need. The world does not beckon, nor does it greatly reward. This is not a boast or a complaint, it is a fact. Serious writing must nowadays be written for the sake of the art. The condition I describe is not extraordinary. Certain scientists, philosophers, historians, and many mathematicians do the same, advancing their causes as they can. One must be satisfied with that. A negative view, but I tend to see it as being true, especially if you interact with people in the world. Most of them don't read anything at all, let alone literature. I think literature is a very niche thing. To say that it must be engaged in some sort of message on the world, yeah, maybe. I don't necessarily think that's true. I think it certainly can make it for a more interesting experience sometimes, especially if it's presented in a way as it is here, which is in a very creative, interesting, and engaging way, and it's not dogmatic or explicit. But there's a certain reality in what Gass says, is that nobody's really listening, or very few people in the world are. Which I don't know if that diminishes the need to have a message, but it certainly diminishes the impact of the message on the world.
Yeah, it's interesting because I feel like she's in this lecture, she's not saying something completely different, except that I think she is trying to place literature in a place that it is advancing. And I guess you could say the same thing about mathematics or science. Like, it might not be the mathematician or the scientist's goal in order to change society. Someone else will take care of that. They're simply representing reality a little bit more accurately. And I think that's what she's trying to say in this essay, is that that's what literature ought to do, not either succumb to sort of popular demand or cordon itself off and say that it has no relation. Like, there's no such thing as science for science. It's like science for reality. And I think that's what she's saying, is it's literature for reality, because we have found ourselves in a new reality. And so we have to find a way, we have to find a language to describe that reality.
And do you feel that this book, Malina, describes a reality? Or the reality?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's funny to read a book like this. And she says in this lecture as well, like, she kind of has a disdain or disregard for the canon, but sort of an idea that, like, you have to reinvent these stories. You have to retell them in new language. They can't just sit on the shelf. They can't, you can't say, well, that one, it's been told, so you just, go pick up the old book. And yet that's what we're doing here. We're picking up a book that's, how old? 50 years old. Yeah. 50 something years old. And was written in a very different sort of era that, before, well, I guess it was after the 60s. It was kind of in the throes of sort of social change, in the post-war era, coming out of a very conservative period of time. So is it possible to read the reality that she was trying to describe?
It's such a hard thing to say, because the reality of this book is, it's a reality of a particular kind of consciousness that I find very hard to relate to. Mm-hmm. It's incredibly engrossing and a wonderful, I don't know about wonderful, but it's so engaging that it's one of the few books I've read back to back, like immediately, in a long time. Because I couldn't
Yeah.
I couldn't parse it when I was finished with it the first time. And yet, even though I was frustrated, I wanted to get a sense of what she was trying to do.
Same. I found the first reading frustrating.
Yeah.
And I didn't feel like I was understanding it. But I found it intriguing enough, and I don't think it's just because I felt on the hook to talk about it, and I was like, I don't know what the heck I'm going to talk about. But like the more that I learn about her thoughts about other things, kind of the influences that went into this book, the more interesting I find it. Yeah, it has an interesting quality in that way. But I love literature for this reason, because it's an experience to read this book. I experienced it the first time. I didn't know what I experienced. And she creates an experience in language, without a doubt.
Unbelievably so. And I think there's a subtlety to the way it makes your mind perceive what's happening in a way that great literature does, right? We talked about this with Proust, and how reading Proust can be frustrating and exhausting, tedious, yet incredibly altering as an experience. Not only for the amount of time you spend with it, but also the way it forces you into having memories, thinking about how memory works, right? And this does it in a way that I don't, because it's not specific enough to anything, and yet it makes me reconsider how my mind thinks about relationships to another person, and my perception of them versus their perception of me, versus how I create the reality of a person in my mind. Did it have any sort of effect on you?
It's really gotten under my skin in a good way. And it's like, I mean, sometimes I have this experience. I'm just reading a review of a philosopher or something. I'm like, oh, I need to learn more about this. And that's how it kind of was with this. And so my experience of this book is I almost feel like it's more like philosophy than it is like literature. Like it wasn't a sort of Proustian experience where the narrative here is kind of so inscrutable, but it's a vehicle for ideas. And so as I learn about Wittgenstein, I'm like, well, how is she representing that concept in this book? Or, thinking about Jung, well, how is that represented in this book? And normally I think that's not, you don't necessarily want to read literature that's just trying to represent ideas. Like you want it to feel real. And I don't know that it really feels real. I don't think it feels real to me. Like I can't really relate to any of it. It's
the way I described it was like it was almost like the ghost of someone was writing a diary. It's like a dying consciousness remembering these moments and confusing reality and putting it down in a sort of daily journal that has no time markers. It's such a strange book to read, man. It really is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's got me interested thinking about all of these ideas, like seriously. And I think that the way that she packages it up and the sort of experience that she creates through fiction is what did that. But at the same time, as a piece of fiction, it's hard to relate to.
It is an experience unlike any other. And because it's so unique, it makes it a good work of literature, not necessarily fiction, if that makes sense.
This is a hard one, man. Okay, there's a lot of quotes that I want to read. I've hardly read any quotes. You picked up the the quotes for this one, but there is one I want to read.
Let's end on this. So make it good.
Because I think it's appropriate. I think it's a good one to end on. One day, all the clochards of Paris were to be removed from the city. The welfare office, which is also responsible for the city's maintaining a decent image, entered the Rue Monge accompanied by the police. All they wanted to do was reassimilate the old men into life, first by washing them, and getting them cleaned up for the same life. Marcel rose and went with them, a very peaceful man, moreover, a wise, docile man after a few glasses of wine. Presumably, their coming that day didn't matter to him in the least, and maybe he also thought he'd be able to return to his good place on the street, where the warm air of the metro wafted up through the ventilation shafts. But inside the washroom, with its many showers for the common good, his turn came too. They placed him underneath the shower, which was certainly not too hot and not too cold. Just that he was naked for the first time in many years, and under water. Before anyone could understand what was happening and reach out to him, he'd fallen dead on the spot. You see what I mean? Malina looked at me a little unsure, although otherwise he's never unsure. I could have spared myself the story. But I can feel the shower once again. I know what it was they should not have been allowed to wash off, Marcel. When someone is living in the vapors of his happiness, when he no longer has many words at his disposal, simply, God bless you, may God reward you, then people should not attempt to wash him, should not wash off what is good for him, should not try and clean him up for a new life that does not exist. What makes her so interesting and a little inscrutable is she includes counterpoints to her points. Maybe this is a critique of sort of logical positivism, or a critique of, trying to eliminate all of those things that are indescribable or, superstition or what have you. Because once you clean all that stuff off, you're dead. There's nothing left. There's no reason to go on living. And it's a very empathetic position to take. It's like it doesn't matter what's true in some regard, because what's true is also those things that are not true.
The truth, the exact truth, will murder you.
Thanks for listening to this winding conversation about Malina. I hope you liked it. If you did, please remember to tap those like and subscribe buttons, and maybe even write us a review. This is really the best way to help other people find the podcast. Next up, we have The Sheltering Sky. This novel was described by Time magazine in 1949 as simply a lurid, super sexy Sahara adventure story completely outfitted with camel trains, handsome Arabs, French officers, and a harem. Personally, I think it's a lot more than that, and maybe the review went on to explain that it was more than that, but it is also that. It's very much a change of pace for us. It is an adventure story in Africa. This book was written in 1949 by Paul Bowles, who was a composer and a writer who spent much of his life living in Morocco and North Africa. I hope you'll join us and read this book along with us. If you haven't purchased it yet, I hope you'll consider supporting the podcast and making your purchase through our affiliate links on booksofsomesubstance.com. Until next time, happy reading.